Hello, citizens of YouTube. DK here with Mr. V Amps. The other day we did a video about trying to recap a vintage solid state amp, and today we're going to look at the tube amp. The rules are very similar, but they're a little bit different, but not by much. So the amp I picked out here is, we've built this Weber 6A14 before, which is essentially a Fender Princeton circuit AA164. Yeah. So Weber calls theirs, what is it? 6A, so 6 for 60s, and then A, and then 14. Again, I don't know what the significance of why they picked that name per se, but let's just assume that we have ourselves a vintage Princeton AA 1164, and we need capacitors. Now, your capacitors in these amps are going to vary based on physical type, and I highly suggest you open up the case and take a look around and figure out what you need inventory wise based on the size and shape of the capacitors. The types of capacitors we'll be dealing with today will primarily be axial. Perhaps we have axial. An axial capacitor, of course, has both of the electrolytic leads here, coming out of one from one side and one from the other. A more modern amp on a PC board will probably have a radial capacitor where both leads come from one side of the can. On a vintage amp, you may have come across these type of metal can caps, and you've probably seen many a technician finding a way to hide some axial or radial capacitors underneath to disconnect one of these that failed. These little puppies are kind of expensive, but on a vintage valuable amp, you can still buy these if you know where to shop, and we're going to cover that. If you're a Marshall guy or a high watt guy, the British used to use can caps kind of like this that fit in a clamp, so those are also available. And certain amps, I have like an old Gibson, and you'll find like these on old phonographs and old radios, these caps, we refer to them as firecrackers, where in this case this is 247 microfarad with a grounding lead. I think this is rated at like 160 volts, so this would be more like for an AA5 kind of radio. But these are definitely available, so that's pretty cool. So the first thing we need to do is to take inventory of what capacitors our amplifier needs, and you want to make yourself a list. So if we look down the list here, we have excuse me, coming off of our tube rectifier, our main filter capacitors, we have 20, 20, 20, and 20, and they're all listed at 450 volts. That's all well and good, so we should be able to select a 450 volt or higher voltage capacitor. If you could find some 475s or maybe 500s, that would be a good thing to do. Okay, and you can actually see these three have little markings on them. You have square, I don't know, what is that, a half circle, triangle, and we'll explain what that is. Then there's another 20 450 over there. We have on our bias circuit, there's our bias circuit, that uses a 25 microfarad 50 volt cap. Again, another cap we could probably bump the voltage up a little bit, because if I remember right, this amp probably floats around 45 volts of bias, so we're pushing it as hard as we can. On our tube here, there's a 25 microfarad cap, 25 volts. Again, we can bump that in voltage. Another 25 here, another 25 here. Yes, this scan is blurry. It's not my fault, I didn't scan it. But the reality is this is probably copied 4,700 times since 1960, whatever the heck. 25, 25, 25, and let's see, none there and none over here. So looks like we only need a few values. That'll make it easier. If we look at the layout diagram here, let's take a look at how this amp is set up. You'll actually see the three of these. There's our triangle, our square, and our half circle, and those are tied to this can looking thing over here. If you've actually seen the amp physically, you'll see what the can looking thing is there. There's our bias cap up there, which is our 25 microfarad 50 volt. And let's see, there should be an additional 20 microfarad floating around here somewhere, and the way that Fender drew it, I'm not sure. These are 0.1, so those would be film caps. 1 minute. Yeah, I know, you should know this by memory, man. You fixed enough of these things. So there's a 25-25 that goes there. These are two 25-25s that go here. 25-25s that go there. And a 25-25 that goes here. Now, I am fairly certain in the schematic that I saw an additional 20 microfarad 450 volt. I need to find that thing. Okay, yeah, give me the Airhead Award here for a mistake. On the can capacitor, all 4 of the 20s are on the can capacitor. One of them has no marking. One of them has the triangle, the square, the half circle, and then the outside of the can is the negative lead or the ground. I don't know why it took me 30 seconds to remember that, but it did. So usually for tube amplifiers, the best place that I can get everything I need at one-stop shopping is Amplified Parts. This is a company, you'll probably hear me mention, I'll say I bought it from CE or CE Distribution. They actually run as Antique Electronic Supply and Amplified Parts. If you're looking for like knobs and pedal making things and sometimes guitar parts and pots and stuff, they got a lot of stuff to fix amplifiers. So let's just go shopping here, and let's start with Browse All Products. Now we know, and then under Browse All Products we want capacitors. Now if we remember from our schematic, all of our super high voltage capacitors here, those were all rated at 450 volts, and they're in a can. So because they're in a can, and assuming we want to replace like with like, let's look specifically for a multi-section can type capacitor that'll limit it down to 77 of them. And then now that we've limited that down, all 4 of those sections are 20 microfarad, so let's just select 20 microfarad, and lo and behold, I have right here a can capacitor, 20 microfarad times 4 with the original markings, nothing, triangle, square, half circle, and it is actually, let's click that up here. Yes, these are expensive. I know they're expensive. Just say ouch. Okay. So if we look, multi-section can capacitor recommended for Fender, Princeton's, blah blah blah, Princeton Reverb AA1164. Hey, look, we're working at a 1164. This is actually the reproduction of the capacitor that originally went in this amp, so you can actually buy it. So let's add that to our cart, despite the fact that the price hurts. Now, so secondarily, that takes care of that one. That was our big lion's share. That was the one that we needed the most, because that's our filter section. That's the one that takes the most abuse. Next, we're looking for our bias capacitor, which they've marked as a 25 microfarad 50 volt. Okay, no problem. So let's go to capacitors. That is an axial capacitor. And let's see, let's going to this site is actually laid out fairly well. Axial leads. And the type of capacitor that it is an electrolytic. I wonder if I can select electrolytic. I can, so I can select electrolytic. Good. That's going to take me down to a couple choices. Now we have the F and T family. These are fine capacitors, but they're 500 volt. This circuit is calling for things that are like 50 volt, 100 volt. And that's, you know, these are going to be modern values. So if you look through the list of them, you're going to see things like 10, 22, 30, and 47, where we're going to see the traditional values under the mods of things like 16, 20, 25, 30, da 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 da. And also in the Sprague atom, you'll find the values that you are looking for. And we even have generic store brand capacitors. Here's 50 volt capacitors here, and I can get a 25 microfarad 50 volt right there for only 40 cents. That's actually what the bias circuit is calling for. But considering that the bias circuit runs a little bit hot, I think for the bias circuit, I will bump up to the next available voltage on that one. Let's see what we have a choice in a mod here for a 25 microfarad. They do have 50 volt. Okay, that's okay. Let's see, I have a 50 volt, I have a 160 volt. That's kind of cool. What do I have here for voltage? I don't have a 25, but I do have a 22 microfarad. Not close enough for me. There's our 2525s in generic form. Alright. 100 volt, that's 100 microfarad. Actually, this probably would work. Having more capacitance on your bias voltage is not a bad thing. By default, I believe it was 25 microfarad. If I had 50 microfarad 50 volt, that would actually 50 microfarad 100 volt, that would probably be a good choice. On capacitors that are not in the tube rectified circuit, in the diode rectified bias circuit, a little bit of bonus capacitance can't hurt anybody. So ideally, I think I'm going to actually up the bias capacitance, because again, that bias is managed by a diode. Okay, there's the diode, so I'm not putting any additional strain really much on the 5U4 rectifier. The 5U4 is feeding this portion of the circuit, where the diode here is, it's for the bias circuit, and it's strictly feeding right off the transformer. So bumping this from a 25 to a 50 microfarad isn't going to hurt anything, and it'll probably possibly kill noise a little bit. So I have a 50 volt 100 or 50 microfarad 100 volt capacitor in the mod brand. And granted, we could probably get something like that in the Sprague brand, and people get real excited for the Sprague brand. It sounds great, right? But let's compare the two. I mean, a mod brand is going to cost me 79 cents, where a slightly higher voltage, granted, Sprague atom is going to cost me $7. These Sprague atoms are rumored to be the greatest capacitors on God's green earth by certain people who really like to have blue capacitors in their amp, but they are cost prohibitive. A lot of us technicians do like to try to get the F&T stuff because it is generally more affordable. A lot of the values are here, and instead of costing $10 a cap for the big boys, or I'm sorry, $20, $15. We look up in here like they're 40s and 50s. You're looking at like $15, $16 a capacitor. A 20 microfarad 600 volt is a $30-some capacitor. It gets painful. I mean, our can cap was $37, right? But that's technically, that's 4 capacitors. So if you divide it down, you're still, $7, $8 a capacitor. It still hurts. But the pricing on these has just been prohibitive per se. There's one or two values. There's like, I believe, 5 microfarad at a low voltage that you're going to find in some of your basements, like your 5 microfarad 50 volt. You're going to find these in some of your basements and your showmans and stuff. They're the only one that makes the exact 5 volt or 5 microfarad, but you can get a 4.7 microfarad and stick in there, and you've probably seen me do that a few times. So let's just shut up. 50 microfarad 100 volt we're going to put in the bias circuit. We'll add that to our shopping cart there, and then we need 25 microfarad for all of our little bypassers, and I think we need like 5 or 6 of them. And they have a 50 volt variety as opposed to the original 25 volt, and I know for a fact, since I own a bunch of these, they're physically not much bigger than the 2525s. If we actually look down here at the 2525 in generic, these are 30 cents a piece, where the 25 microfarad 50 volt mod capacitors are well, they're significantly more expensive. But again, by the time it shakes out and you buy the 5 or 6 or 7 of these that you actually need, it's going to come out in the wash. And I know these guys will give me a price break if I buy 10, so I'll just throw 10 in the cart, and believe it or not, that will actually complete our shopping list, I'm fairly certain. Let's see here. Shopping cart. View our shopping cart. Let's make sure I got them all. I've got my 2020, which is our can cap. That covers our mains. I've got a bias cap here, and I've got our bypass caps on all of our tubes. Let's just double check to see if that's what we need for sure, and I don't need anything additional. Can cap times 4. Good. We decided to go with a slightly better bias cap, and I need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I need 6 of these, and I've got 10 of them, so beautiful. And how much of a price break did I get on these when I bought 10? They didn't do it. Oh, well, I guess they only give you a price break when you're a dealer. So technically, if I need 6 and not 10, let's do that and update our cart. And we will find out that our grand total to get our capacitors before our shipping, which will probably be, I don't know, 10 bucks. So we're looking at about $50 US to recap this amp and keep the original style can capacitor. If we want to cheap out, we could probably try to delete that, but you know, we don't necessarily have to. So the nice thing is amplified parts, CE distribution, these guys tend to have a really good selection of stuff specifically for the amplifier industry, you know, for amplifier repair guys. And you know, for example, if I was fixing up an amp that I picked up at the auction, and while I was here I needed to get a knob for, you know, I don't know, let's just say this was a Fender Princeton, I could go and get the top hat knobs that this amp would actually need, reproduction top hat knobs. Actually, these are OEM, but you know, the original style. I can grab a couple knobs, you know, get it fixed. It just makes life easier when you can get everything you need in one shot. So I hope that helps you just get an idea of where, you know, where and how I shop and figure out how to do a tube amp when I have to recap them, because we have to recap them a lot. Now, in addition to this, depending on which capacitors are in this amp, for things like the 0.1s and the 0.02s and all of those, generally those need not be replaced. Fender had a habit of using the reasonable quality blue Astron moldeds, which didn't go bad, and then in later years they were using the film caps that some people refer to as the blue turds or the brown turds. Some people pretend that those sound awful, and if you think they sound awful, you can pick up some, you know, like yellow tubulars, or some people get really excited about the orange drop capacitors. And the orange drops, even though they are radial, they do have very, very long leads, and you can spread them out. If you've ever looked through, you know, my videos and what I'm doing, I do a lot of these 630 volt metal film tubular capacitors, as well as the red dropped capacitors here, primarily because they work well and they're very affordable. If we do take a note on our schematic here, it does mention, I did see it. Where did it go? Where did it go? I saw a note. Was it on this page or was it on the other page? Maybe it was on the other page. It was. So resistors that need to be replaced are a 1/2 watt unless otherwise noted. So if you look at, you know, some of the higher wattage resistors, like this one is a 1K, and I believe that says 1 watt, and 18K 1 watt. So they will specify otherwise. If not, it would be a 1/2 watt resistor or better. And for our, you know, our cap values here, you know, we have like a 0.047 and a 0.1. The yellow tubulars would be the appropriate replacements for those. So I hope that helps you out with your shopping if you decide to recap a vintage amp. And the other thing you kind of have to do if you want to go, you know, let's say you were doing a twin reverb or something like that, you wanted to put, you know, premium axial capacitors in that, and you don't want to do the mod brand like I do, because you know you got to be cool and you want to be more like I don't know, you want to be more like D-Lab or something, and you want the F and T's. You're going to find if you have a value like 40, you're going to be rounding it up to 47. If you have a value like 20, you're going to be rounding it up to 22. Now on an amp like a twin reverb, it's not as big of a deal because it has a diode rectifier. It's diode rectified. But if you do have an amp like the Princeton Reverb or something like that that has a rectifier tube, which would be like a 5U4 or a GZ34, 5AR4, or a 5Y3, if your amp is tube rectified, try very carefully to not go around and modify the microfarad value. Feel free to go up on voltage a bit, no problem, but try to keep your microfarads in check if your amp has a tube rectifier. Alright, cool, and this is going to go on forever if I don't shush, so thank you for watching and have a great day.